September 1872. It's election day, and an angry mob has gathered on a muddy street corner in a backwater little village on the prairies. They're armed and drunk. They've just been at a brawl at a polling station across the river. They took pot shots at the officials, beat up its occupants, destroyed the building, and burned the poll book. They're being whipped into a frenzy by their leader, a man with a fierce history and a long and violent criminal record. In a few short years, this little village, Winnipeg, will become the capital of a brand new province, Manitoba.
And this violent leader of the riots, Francis C. Cornish, will become its first mayor. My name's William Jordan, and this is Historicity.
Cornish Street and the Cornish Library. Dignified, stately, and quiet. Everything I'm discovering, our first mayor, Francis Cornish, was not. Well, we got Churchill and Clinton, but here at the Cornish Library, there's surprisingly little on the man himself. So our search will have to begin at the beginning.
The people of London, Ontario rushed to the ballot boxes after a hard-fought election campaign. The underdog in the race that year is one Francis Evans Cornish. Though he's been dubbed by the papers as the rowdy candidate, his resume was impressive.
Born the youngest of 5 children to an Irish immigrant family, Cornish immediately set himself apart. Ambitious and brilliant, at age 26 he became one of the youngest lawyers ever appointed to Queen's Counsel. And now, at age 30, he set his sights on becoming Mayor of London.
Popular opinion, however, was not in his favor.
It would be a disgrace if Cornish were elected mayor. He is one of the greatest scamps in the city. Amelia Harris, citizen of London, 1861.
Cornish's reputation was one of a heavy drinker, a brawler and a womanizer. His morals were flexible, as he himself famously admitted. I can never defend anyone properly unless I believe that they're innocent. And it'll take $300 to make me believe that you're innocent. Cornish didn't stand much of a chance getting elected in a law and order town like London. But law and order never bothered Cornish. He was a clever lawyer, and he had discovered a loophole that he was going to use to its full advantage. Is he coming back?
The scheme was unconventional, to say the least. The evening before the election, Cornish found his way into an encampment of British soldiers stationed just outside of town. With barrels of whiskey in tow, Francis convinced them to move their camp inside the city limits, making them all eligible voters. The next morning, after an evening of food, drink, and charm, 2,000 drunk soldiers crawled their way to the voting booths to cast their vote for King Cornish. To the great surprise of the people of London, when the ballots came in, Francis Evans Cornish won by a landslide.
Cornish's time as Mayor of London was, like the man, fast, turbulent, and paradoxical. Stories of his rowdy behavior were legendary. 1 year into his term, Cornish was arrested for driving his carriage through City Hall. Needless to say, alcohol was involved. He was taken to court and pleaded guilty. But he had a plan. As mayor, the highest authority in the town, Cornish had the power to appoint the judge he thought was best. And today, the judge he thought was best was himself. The judge, Cornish, fined the defendant, Cornish, a paltry $4. But Stating the defendant's previous good character, he reduced the fine to $2. Thank you, my lord. He then reminded the court that a judge of such exceptional character would need to be well paid for his time. His fee? $4. Thank you, Mr. Cornish. He then topped it all off by giving a long and eloquent speech on the follies of public drinking. Members of the jury.
But Cornish's unruly behavior began to catch up with him. After a particularly drunken brawl with a high-ranking British officer, he was reprimanded and hauled before his own city council. In the election that followed, he suffered a humiliating defeat. He tried to win a seat in provincial government. He lost. His law practice was floundering. He would lose that too. His marriage ended. His temper and drinking only got worse.
London police record, F.E. Cornish. Assault during attempted theft of impounded cattle, fined $8. 2 counts of assault on a British Army officer, dismissed from local militia. Vandalism and theft of barber pole. Assault with stolen barber pole. Public drunkenness, fined $2. Theft and assault with bricks. Destruction of all the trees on Main Street. Slanderous language. Cursing at mayor, fined $10.
There was nothing left for him in London. Cornish decided he had to leave town. London wasn't exactly unhappy to see him set sail.
It has a defiance, like that of the black flag of the pirates, which is kept still flying as the illegal craft disappears from sight and becomes powerless for future mischief. London Free Press, 1871.
But where to go? There was one town that was as wild and woolly as he was, one that could use a man of his talents.
I'm going to Manitoba, and I'm gonna raise hell. Francis Cornish. But I wanted to learn more about that town that Cornish was gonna raise hell in. So I met up with my old pal, Professor Gordon Goldsborough, at the Festival de Voyageurs, a celebration of Winnipeg's early history. After getting a considerable groove on, Gord filled me in on the Winnipeg Cornish arrived in.
Just on the verge of when Manitoba entered Confederation in 1870, this was a fur trade post, pretty much entirely. There was a small community on the east side of the Red River, which was mostly Francophone and Catholic. There was another community on the west side of the Red River that was mostly Protestant and Anglophone, and they were all basically in some way connected to the Hudson's Bay Company. They were the force. It was only when things began to change, when, for example, the land the Hudson's Bay Company owned was being transferred to Canada's control, that things really began to go bad.
The Winnipeg to which Cornish was headed was a small Wild West town in the middle of a hostile takeover. The local government, led by Louis Riel, was under intense pressure to join Canada. To ensure things went his way, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald sent an army, the Wolseley Expedition, bent on revenge for the execution of their compatriot Thomas Scott. When the mission was over, many stayed in town to start a new life. This new population completely changed the culture of Red River. Unable to cope with the recent influx, the police force was overwhelmed. Drinking in the streets became commonplace, as was prostitution and gambling. Winnipeg gained a reputation for being one of the most depraved and lawless places in the country.
What a sorry sight was presented by that long-thought-of town of Winnipeg on the day we entered it. What a mass of soft, black, slippery, and sticky Red River mud was everywhere spread out before us. Streets with neither sidewalks nor crossings, with now and again a good-sized pit of mire for the traveler to avoid or flounder through as best he could. A few small stores with poor goods and high process. One little tavern, few passable dwellings with no rooms to let nor space for boarders, neither church nor school in sight or in prospect. Such was Winnipeg on July 4th, 1868. George Young, Reverend.
Cornish represented everything that was bad about these newly arriving Canadians. He was Anglophone and only Anglophone. He was Protestant. He represented the interests that wanted to make money here, as opposed to simply living their lives here.
There was lots of money to be made, or appropriated. With the Métis population retreating from the province for safer pastures elsewhere, a group of Wolseley expedition veterans, calling themselves the Canada Party, began buying up land around Winnipeg on the cheap. They now made it their mission to make this little hamlet a new capital city. They were pretty sure that this would be a big return on their investment.
In the matter of incorporation, some people seem to be getting almost crazy. They seem to imagine that it only requires incorporation to make the hamlet of Winnipeg jump into a great, flourishing, magnificent commercial city. For our part, we cannot see it. Manitoban, April 1872.
Cornish arrived in Winnipeg by train on June 12, 1872. He was welcomed at the station by the president of the Canada Party.
He had a job Cornish was perfect for.
So they bring us in to fight for leaders, but we don't even have the right to vote for them? We don't have the right
The Canada Party had a problem. Most of the party members had just arrived with the Wolseley expedition. They had not lived in Winnipeg long enough to meet the residency requirements. Therefore, in the coming election, they would not be allowed to vote.
They were outraged, but there didn't seem to be an obvious solution. And so on election day, a meeting was called of all Canada Party members. After multiple drinks and much confusion, Cornish saw his opportunity. He made a passionate call to arms. They were going to get their votes by any means necessary.
I will now give you a few words about the row we had at the election day. I must tell you that there was 2 polling places, one in the town and one across the Red River. So in the morning, there was some fellows came to me and wanted me to go across. I took a lot of wagon spokes with me to defend ourselves. It's not the half-breeds alone we have to deal with, but Hudson Bay Man and all those men that is in power. They are on the half-breed side. But we have one smart man to stand us. Mr. Cornish. George Campbell, railroad worker.
Cornish led the well-lubricated mob across the river, into the heart of French territory, the post office in St. Boniface serving as the polling station. They demanded that they be allowed to vote. When they were refused, the mob attacks the unarmed officials. A high-ranking Canada Party member fires a gun into the fray. Fortunately, he was too intoxicated to hit anyone or anything. Ransacking the house, the mob find the poll book and burn it in a massive fire.
The mob armed themselves with shillelaghs, and a riot occurred of so formidable a character that the military were called out. The mob appeared to be inspired by inflammatory addresses of one Francis Evans Cornish. At all events, the people of Winnipeg hold him responsible. London Free Press, September 20th, 1872.
Despite all efforts, the riot continues to intensify, with Cornish inciting the mob. His tirade leaves no one out. The HBC president, the lieutenant governor, and the head of the provincial police, who Cornish calls a toad-eating communist.
When the police are called in to restore order, Cornish leads the mob in a charge.
The carbines were wrested from the police and they were rapped over the head with them. The police were then reinforced and proceeded to attack the crowd, but they were at once disarmed of their batons, and they themselves thrust in the police station downstairs and locked up. John Christian Schultz, Canada Party President, September 20th, 1872.
The mob now has free reign of the whole town. The riot reaches its climax when Cornish leads the mob in the destruction of all the city's newspapers.
A perfect pandemonium of printers' ink. Windows smash, press ditto. The Métis newspaper office, as near as I can hear, went bodily out of the window. It will be some time before they can express their grievances in print. John Christian Schultz.
By the end of Election Day, only one newspaper was left standing. The Manitoba Liberal, owned and operated by the Canada Party.
A riot took place during which the offices of the Manitoban Gazette and La Métis were sacked. There was consequently an almost universal suspension of the newspapers in the province. We have no wish to dwell on the scene of disorder and destruction. Alexander Begg, journalist.
Overnight, Winnipeg earns the title the Graveyard of Journalism. and Cornish is beginning to make powerful enemies.
The election riots in Winnipeg and St. Boniface are greatly to be regretted. I trust that the local authorities will take every step to bring the ringleaders to justice. I think it is time that you should put an end to this lawless spirit, which if allowed to spread may cause infinite mischief. I would recommend you by all means to get Cornish indicted. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald to Lieutenant Governor Archibald.
But none of this was going to slow Cornish down. In fact, with the opposition newspapers silenced, the Canada Party was pushing their agenda harder than ever. In the 11th hour, the Incorporation Bill, declaring Winnipeg the new capital, drafted by Cornish himself, is ruled out of order by Speaker of the House and local town doctor James Curtis Bird. Cornish's supporters are furious. That night, a knock at the door awakens Dr. Bird. A young child frantically tells him that there's a medical emergency. He must come at once.
They hopped into a horse-drawn sleigh. Admittedly, ours has a few more horses. They take off for Kildonan, a small colony north of the city.
He doesn't get far. While passing Browns Creek, his sleigh is stopped by a band of toughs. He's grabbed and pulled from the sleigh.
He's beaten unconscious, tarred and feathered. Brutal, but effective. By the end of the year, Winnipeg is incorporated as the capital of Manitoba.
And when the question was asked, who would be the first mayor of this new capital city, Cornish's name was rising to the top. What finally put Cornish over the top was his principal role in the show trial of the century.
I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so much as historical research allows.
Could you please state your name for the court?
My name is Gordon Goldsborough.
And Mr. Goldsborough, what can you tell me about the trial of Ambrose Lapine?
Well, he was one of the fall guys for the 1870 Red River Resistance. And he and Louis Riel were perceived as being the two that had to pay for the insurrection that the Canadian government perceived had occurred here.
I do respectfully but energetically enter my protest against a proceeding by which myself out of 1,000 is selected to bear exclusively the responsibility of acts done by a government which the people of a country had publicly and voluntarily invested in. In conclusion, I repel with all my strength the heinous accusation directed against me. Ambroise Lupin.
But Cornish played to the popular sentiment, outrage at English Thomas Scott's execution by a French government. Who, let me ask, was this Thomas Scott? A young man who, because of his loyalty to his queen and country, was taken and killed, murdered foully, because he dared to be loyal to his crown and country by men of whom the prisoner was one. Francis Cornish.
And what was the result of the trial, Mr. Goldsborough?
Well, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. I mean, I don't think anyone really truly expected that the outcome would be anything other than a guilty verdict. And that, in fact, was what happened. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to hang.
And how did this affect Mr. Cornish's career?
Oh, it was entirely positive, mainly because he was hoping to cement his position as one of the foremost members of society in the Red River settlement.
And this sort of solidified his popularity.
Absolutely. He was ascendant. Obviously, Cornish had aspirations. He wanted to be someone in this community. He wanted to be someone powerful.
And the race for that seat of power was heating up. Opponents quickly rallied against him, led by 28-year-old newspaperman William Luxton. Luxton was everything Cornish was not. He ran on a platform to bring morality and temperance back to the city.
I don't belong to any of the codfish aristocracy. Mr. Cornish, during his term of office in London, was brought before the council for misdemeanor. I believe it was the first time that the mayor of any city was brought before his own council. We want not only a man of intelligence, but a man of morals. I have as much right to run on morality as Mr. Cornish has on experience. William Luxton, candidate.
Despite his best efforts, Cornish's reputation preceded him. the election was still too close to call.
And so he went back to the tried and true methods that worked for him so well in London. He bent the law. He discovered another loophole.
Our first civic election for mayor in 1874 really was a controversial one, not just because the leading candidate was accused of buying votes, burning poll books, or inciting riots.
Brian Bowman is Winnipeg's 43rd mayor. He offered some interesting perspectives on the first election results.
The results, they were outrageous. There were 382 names on the voters list, but 562 votes were cast. Francis Cornish had defeated William Luxon, editor of the Winnipeg Free Press, and the community was in turmoil. It was eventually shown that Cornish, always the clever lawyer, had discovered a loophole in the election laws, and this oversight was immediately corrected, but too late for this first election. One could vote according to property held. Those owning property in more than one ward could legally vote more than once. Cornish encouraged the members of the Canada Party, who had been buying up real estate, to vote for him twice if necessary. Unethical, certainly, but legal. While despite his controversial methods, his 1 year as mayor was remarkably successful. One of his first endeavors was making good on his campaign promise to fix Winnipeg's terrible roads.
A tradition that continues to this day.
He set the town on a path that would see the population double and then double again and eventually become one great city that it is today.
Cornish's ambition wasn't satisfied with just being mayor. He refused to campaign, instead directing all his energies toward his new target, the provincial legislature. He wins a seat as MLA of Poplar Point, but even that isn't enough. He wants the #1 job, Premier of the province.
The Premier and Cornish took up all day in haranguing and abusive language, kept up from 3 till 7:30. Liberal MLA Kenneth Mackenzie.
All that haranguing and abuse didn't help him, however. When election day came, Cornish knew he was behind. This time he could find no legal loophole. But that wasn't going to stop Francis Cornish.
January 3rd, 1876, 9 p.m., 5 minutes before the polls close, a group attacks a West Ward polling station in St. Boniface. The Manitoba Free Press reports.
Not content with breaking up the poll in the East Ward, yesterday a party of rowdies, headed by F.E. Cornish last evening, repaired to the house of Mr. Huggard, returning officer for the West Ward. Gained admittance and prevailed upon Mr. Huggard to show them the poll book. While looking at the book, one of Mr. Cornish's party snatched and made off with it. Mr. Huggard attempted its rescue, in which he was assisted by his wife. A general melee ensued, during which the light was put out, the stove thrown over and smashed, and Miss Huggard seriously injured by blows dealt her by some of the party. It is said, however, she succeeded in punishing some of them severely with a stove stick. Manitoba Free Press, 1876.
Cornish is arrested and spends the night in jail. He makes his bail the next morning of $2,000. Eventually, however, he's fined just $20. This doesn't affect his good humor, however, as the Manitoba Free Press reported. He had a piece of advice for the returning officer. That was to take good care of the poll book. Cornish's reputation was in tatters. Now, even the MLA seat he held for so long was in serious jeopardy. But Cornish was not the kind of man to retire gracefully. If he would go down, he would go down fighting.
He hatches a final, desperate scheme. Cornish has his opponent kidnapped and locked up in a remote cabin. He then brought up charges of corruption against him.
Cornish argued that if the accused does not appear in court in person, well then, is it not obvious that he's guilty?
The plan was too crazy for even Cornish to pull off. His opponent escapes, and Cornish is arrested for the kidnapping.
Once again, Cornish escapes the charges. But this time, not by clever loophole or inciting of violence. It's the final escape. Just a few months after his arrest, Cornish dies suddenly in November of 1878. He was just 49 years old.
As for Winnipeg, the city he left behind, it saw immense growth. A national railroad would see Winnipeg explode into a boom town with the most expensive property in the entire world. From imperfect, fragile, and violent beginnings, a city was born that shaped the lives of millions.
What year is this? Keep yelling. One more time.